Hello again and welcome to Brigham Young University Hawaii's online economics course. Today we're going to talk about two macroeconomic topics and principles. One is unemployment and the other one is inflation. To do this, we're going to have to make a lot of definitions. Now remember from our previous chapters and discussions, anything that is red and bolded on a slide, something you're going to have to learn how to define, and you're going to have to put it in a real-world context somewhere throughout the rest of this class, whether that's through papers, responses, or exams. So pay close attention. We have a lot of definitions to cover today. The first one is unemployment. Unemployment is the problem that we currently have in the economy, and it's a problem for any economy. What it is in terms of numerical calculations is it's the total number of adults. Now remember, we calculate adults differently economically because adults in legal sense are people who are 18 years of age and older, but in economics they're 16 years of age and older. So it's the total number of adults, everybody 16 years of age and older, who are willing and able to work and who are actively looking for jobs but have not found a job. So you have to be willing and able to work, actively looking but haven't found a job. Unemployment creates an interesting and fairly expansive cost to an entire economy in terms of lost output, often ranging in the billions and billions of dollars. When you think about it, having 2, 3, 4% unemployment represents millions and millions of workers just in the United States who are out of jobs. When you don't have a job, your spending is reduced dramatically. And if you don't have a job and don't have a lot of savings, your spending is largely ground to a halt. So if you're not spending money, you're not buying food, you're not buying DVDs, you're not buying books, you're not buying any of these things, then the companies that would traditionally have been selling those products are going to have lower sales. They in turn will end up laying off some of their employees because their sales are lower and their profits are lower. Then those employees that they just laid off, they're also going to have a crimp in their spending. So having an unemployment rate that is higher than desired can cause economists and politicians some serious heartburn. They worry about it, and they should worry about it. Governments try to put in place policies that reduce unemployment, that make it so more and more people are employed. And in fact, in the United States since 1946, at the end of World War II, the government has been increasingly more and more active in the labor markets, trying to reduce the amount of unemployment in our economy. Let's talk about a couple of other definitions that will lead us to some equations for calculating the unemployment rate. The first one is the labor force. The labor force is just individuals 16 years of age and older, in other words adults, who either have jobs or are looking and available for jobs. It's the number of employed and the number of unemployed people together. That's the total potential labor force. The unemployment rate is just the percentage of the major labor force that's unemployed. If you look at this graph, you can see that over time, the unemployment rate, and this is as a percentage of the total labor force, the unemployment rate has changed dramatically. Lots of ups and downs. This is the big one, where over 25% of the U.S. labor force was unemployed. And that's during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was a severe reduction in economic activity. That reduction in economic activity caused more and more companies to lay off their employees, and that laying off of employees created a situation where 25% of the total labor force were unemployed. What's particularly interesting about this, and in this graph you can see it, each one of these yellow bars are periods of war. And what you can see from the Great Depression is at 25%, now the war starts to become raging in Europe. And as it waged in Europe, a lot of U.S. businesses began to produce war materials for European countries. And that caused our unemployment rate, which was above 25%, to quickly come down. Then the United States got active in the war. And as we became active in the war, our unemployment rate plummeted. And what that meant is we had more and more idle factories that were now put to work making war machines, tanks, guns, jeeps, various other things. But in addition, we had a lot more people who were unemployed who are now part of the military force. and that reduced the unemployment rate. So wars traditionally have an impact on unemployment in reducing the overall unemployment rate. So by equation, the labor force is nothing more than the total number of employed people we have and the unemployed. That constitutes the total labor force. The unemployment rate, which you often see quoted on the news and in the Wall Street Journal and other publications, is just the unemployed people, number of unemployed, over this total labor force. So the total number that don't have jobs. Now this data here, which is a couple of years old, shows that our unemployment rate is 6.7%. Now as we sit here in 2010, towards the end of 2010, the unemployment rate is currently 9.6%. So officially, by our definitions, almost 10% or 1 in 10 Americans who can work and who would like to work are not working. You can see how that impact would have a significant knock-on impact on the total U.S. economy. And so politicians are concerned about it. Politicians have established stimulus packages and other programs, which we'll talk about later, and their intent is to spend enough money to get people employed so that that unemployment rate goes down. Okay, a couple of other definitions that are worth understanding. One's stock and the other one's flow. Stock is just a quantity of something measured at a given point in time, for example, an inventory of goods. If you're an automobile company, you lose a lot of steel. Your stock of steel is the amount of steel that you have in the back room ready and available to be used in making a car. A flow is different. A flow is a quantity measured over time, such as the income that you make per year or the number of individuals that are fired every month. So stock is a static number. It sits there, it doesn't move. Flow measured how things move through an economy, through a system, through an employment program. Let's talk about categories of people who don't have work. Job losers. This is most of them. People who don't have work typically are laid off. An individual whose employment was involuntarily, they didn't choose to, involuntarily terminated, or who was laid off. They were fired, laid off. Reduction in force is the politically correct way to phrase that now. So of the total unemployed people in an economy, and in the U.S. economy, between 40% and 60% of those who are unemployed are job losers. They lost their jobs through being laid off or fired. Reentrants, this is another interesting term, an individual who has worked a full-time job but has left the labor force and has now re-entered it looking for a job. This is an interesting concept because it happens a lot with women. Where women are full-time employees, maybe they decide to have a child. So they leave the workforce for 9 months to a year or whatever. They have their child and then they decide to go back to the labor force. They would be classified as a reentrant. And about 20 to 30% of those who are unemployed are considered reentrants. Those who left the labor force, now they're coming back in, they're looking for a job, and so they're classified as unemployed. Job leavers, which are the smallest component here, are individuals who voluntarily quit and hate their job, didn't want to be an accountant, and who can blame them? But they didn't want to be an accountant, so they decided to leave their job and go and find a different job. New entrants are individuals who never worked a full-time job for 2 weeks or longer and are now entering the market. So a lot of reasons why this happens. Perhaps somebody has just gotten out of college and they're now looking for a job, so they're a new entrant into the market. Somebody who just turned 16, so now they're counted as an adult for economic purposes, and they're trying to enter the job market. Those would be new entrants, and they account for 10 to 15% of the total unemployed. So what you can see is there's a bit of a cycle that occurs. We go from being employed, and for one of those 4 reasons, we become unemployed. And as we become unemployed, then we start looking for jobs. We acquire a job, and we become employed. The reason why it's important to look at it like this is because there's a constant flow in an economy of employed people. And in fact, about 1/3 of all employees are going to be changing jobs in any given year. So if you consider that we have 152 million employed people in the United States, about 50 million of those people will be looking for a job in any given year. That's an amazing amount of flow or movement of employed people. And it's the amazing part of the capitalist system that it is able to connect jobs with people on such an amazingly regular and large basis. So let's talk about duration of employment or duration of unemployment. This is a big deal. More than 1/3 of job seekers find a job within 1 month of being unemployed. Another third find employment within the second month. About 1/6 of them are still unemployed after 6 months. However, the average duration is just over 15 weeks for the last 15 years. So if we take all of the unemployment data for the last 15 years, we find that the average unemployed person is unemployed for 15 weeks. Now, averages don't always tell the story. And recessions, as we'll talk about it here in just a minute, are an important factor in what happens in unemployment. But consider that in our current economic dilemma, sitting here at the end of 2010, the duration of unemployment has increased significantly. We are well past the average of 15 weeks for those who are unemployed. What that means is that the duration of unemployment in our current recession has increased dramatically to where we have a large number of unemployed who have been unemployed for over 6 months. That's unusual. It's more common during recessions, but it's a little bit unusual. So the question is, what's likely to happen to the duration of unemployment during a recession, during a downturn in an economy? Well, in general, companies are hesitant to hire unless they know that good times are just around the corner or good times are happening. So during economic good times, employers are fairly free with their hiring policies. They look at an employee and they say, well, this employee is going to bring us value. We have a lot of increase in sales, so it makes sense. During economic downturns or recessions, the opposite is occurring. Companies are looking at their revenues either going down or staying flat, and they don't see a lot of growth in the future, so they're more and more hesitant to hire. This hesitancy to hire means that unemployed people stay unemployed longer, and they sit in the unemployment rolls for longer and longer periods of time. This is particularly troublesome for politicians and economists alike, because economists can see the problem with having a lot of unemployed, and the knock-on effects that we talked about earlier is they're spending less money. Spending less money means that companies are selling less goods. So companies are selling less goods means that they're going to fire more employees and has a knock-on effect. But also, politically, creates instability. And that's what you're starting to see in the United States here as we enter the next election cycle, where there are enough unemployed people to where there's some economic and political instability. And politicians get really worried about that. They see that their likelihood of being voted out of office is increasing. And that is fairly typical for economic downturns as well. So politicians try and do things that would make it less hard on those who are unemployed. We talked about the duration of unemployment expanding. Well, remember, since we assumed that the average unemployed person is unemployed for 15 weeks, we establish unemployment benefits based upon that average. And when our current situation makes it so the duration of unemployed extends well beyond 15 weeks, people run out of unemployment benefits and they have no money. So the government steps in and extends those unemployment benefits or creates other stimulus measures and programs to try and be able to get people more and more employed. So the government takes a very active role during recessions to try and get unemployment rates to go down. Let's talk about discouraged workers. Remember the discussion we had earlier, which said, look, the labor force constitutes people who are unemployed and those who are employed. But amongst those who are unemployed, we have a lot of people who are looking for jobs, who are able to work, who finally just step back and say, this is useless. I can't find a job that matches my skills with the kind of pay that I need. So they get discouraged, and they willingly sometimes pull themselves out of the labor force. They stop looking for jobs. So discouraged workers are individuals who have stopped looking for a job because they're convinced that they will not find a suitable one. So how would you think that discouraged workers create a problem for unemployment rates? What's interesting is that they tend to overstate the magnitude of the unemployment problem and understate it in recessions. This is why. If you're a discouraged worker, you willfully take yourself out of the labor force because you stopped looking for a job. Well, you had a job before, right? Then you started looking for a job. You were classified as unemployed, but still part of the labor force. And now you've stopped looking, which takes you out of the labor force. Remember, that reduces the size of the denominator in the unemployment calculation. So when you have discouraged workers, it understates the level of unemployment. So we have unemployment right now of 9.6%. But we have a lot of discouraged workers who've taken themselves out of the labor force. So it's reasonable to assume that our real unemployment rate isn't 9.6%, but is higher, because those discouraged workers still exist, they still have no jobs, and they've removed themselves from the labor force. Some have estimated that because of discouraged workers, that our real unemployment rate is closer to 16% in the United States. And that's a big deal, and it's a big difference. Labor force participation rates, this is just the proportion of non-institutionalized, so people who are not in jail and not in mental institutions, working age individuals who are employed or seeking employment. The major types of unemployment are interesting and important to make sure that you understand. The first two tend to be a little bit confusing, and the last two are fairly simple. We have frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal. Frictional unemployment is just the result from the fact that workers are constantly searching for appropriate job offers, and a lot of times they can't find them. It takes time. So as you're looking for a new job, you're out in the market, you're looking at the online ads for jobs, you're looking at the newspapers for jobs, you're trying to contact friends to see if you can get some connections for a job, and you're in the market looking for a job. You just haven't connected up your skills with the job offers that are out there. And so this is called frictional unemployment. People who are looking for jobs, who are capable for jobs, but can't find the match just yet. That's frictional unemployment. And there's a natural level of unemployment from friction that occurs in any economy all the time. Structural unemployment is a little bit different. This says there's a poor match of workers' abilities and skills with the current requirements of employers. So in other words, employers are looking for a certain skill. The people who want jobs have a different skill, and those two are not able to match up. That's called structural unemployment. Cyclical unemployment has something to do with the business cycle. And we'll talk about the business cycle here in just a minute. But cyclical unemployment exists because every economy goes through ups and downs. And when you have downsides of an economy, you have more unemployment. So any unemployment that is tied to the cyclical nature of a business cycle is called cyclical unemployment. Seasonal unemployment is very different, and we typically adjust our unemployment numbers for seasonal unemployment. These are the results from seasonal pattern of work in specific industries. In ski industry, you work largely during the summer or during the winter when there's snow. Some ski resorts have special alpine slides and things during the summertime, but most of the revenue comes during the winter when there's snow on the mountains. There's a lot of other industries. Education has some seasonal aspects to it. Beach and vacations have some seasonal aspects to it. So there's a lot of employment that is seasonal. And so when you're out of season, those employees are often laid off and waiting for the next peak season to occur. So this level of seasonal employment occurs frequently in many industries. When we calculate our unemployment numbers, we typically adjust for this seasonal unemployment and we remove it. All right, let's talk about full employment. It's a fairly arbitrary level of employment that corresponds to what we think is normal friction in the labor market. So it's this normal level of people out of a job looking for a job and they just haven't connected yet. And we assume that there's a level of that that's normal, that we accept as natural unemployment, because it's just people looking and waiting to connect up with a job. So with that in mind, we assume that there's a level of that that's normal. We also have this idea that full employment is the level of employment where we allow a little bit of frictional unemployment, but everybody else is fully engaged and fully employed. This natural rate of unemployment with friction and structural unemployment is something that is hotly debated among economists, and nobody agrees on it. It's an unemployment rate that is estimated to prevail in the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. In other words, it never goes away. It's always there. There's always people who are going to be naturally out in the market looking for jobs, trying to connect up with the job requirements, and it just takes time to find those. It takes time to connect them. It doesn't reflect cyclical unemployment, and it definitely doesn't reflect seasonal unemployment. So in a natural rate of unemployment, you definitely have frictional unemployment, and you have some structural unemployment, but you don't have cyclical unemployment and you don't have seasonal unemployment. All right, those will give us some good definitions for unemployment. We're going to talk about that again in later chapters in more detail. But now we're going to turn our attention to inflation and deflation. We're going to hit this, then talk about business cycles, then we'll be done for the day. Inflation is a sustained increase in the average of all prices of goods and services in an economy. Remember, we said sustained increase, so it's not just a temporary up and down. This is a sustained increase on the average of all prices, and we hit both goods and services. These are fairly important delineations in this definition. Deflation is just the opposite. It's a sustained decrease in the average of all prices of goods and services in an economy. So in this section, we're going to talk about inflation and a little bit about deflation, and hopefully we'll be able to identify them well enough to where you can understand their impacts on an economy. The biggest impact of inflation is on purchasing power. The value of money for buying goods and services, it varies with prices and income. But consider purchasing power as an interesting example about your grandma. Your grandma gives you $100 as you graduate from high school. She gives it to you and says, look, save this money, it'll serve the basis for your retirement. But you're not a saver, you're a spender. So what you're going to do is you're going to put this money in your wallet and you're going to hold on to it for, say, a year. Well, $100 a year ago bought $100 worth of goods and services. But a year later, that same $100 won't buy as much as it did a year ago. The reason why it won't is because prices went up. So the price for a gallon of milk rose, the price for a box of Lucky Charms rose, the price for your gasoline rose, the price for a car. All of those increased. So your purchasing power fell. The amount of stuff that you could buy with that $100 fell. So inflation, first and foremost, erodes your purchasing power, reduces your ability to buy stuff. So let's talk about what inflation is in both nominal and real terms. Nominal value ignores whatever happens to inflation. So in terms of nominal value, I would say that $100 a year ago is the same as $100 today. It's still $100, isn't it? That's nominal value. But its real value is different. The real value is a value adjusted for inflation. So if inflation was 5% over that 1 year period, in the beginning of the year when your grandma first gave you the $100, the value was $100. But if inflation was 5% over the year, then the value of your $100 in real terms, or adjusted for inflation, would be 5% lower. So it would be equivalent to having $95 a year ago. So nominal is not adjusted for inflation. Real values are adjusted for inflation. So let's talk about this inflation rate, how we measure it, and what we do with it. There's lots of difficulty in measuring it, and we're going to talk about 4 ways of measuring and some of the problems of each one of those 4. But in general, what we do is we create a market basket. And say we'll do this in 1982, which is when a lot of our market baskets were created. And what we'll do is we'll say, well, the average family in 1982 purchased X gallons of milk, X loaves of bread, this type of car, this type of house, and all those things. And we're going to set prices for 1982, and that's going to be our base year. And we're going to assume that that market basket really doesn't change over years, and we're going to measure that market basket every year. Well, in the base year of 1982, how much did a gallon of milk cost? Then we're going to measure it again in 1983. How much did a gallon of milk cost then? Then 1984, 85, 86, so on, all through these years. And that market basket serves as the basis for how we measure our inflation. How much does that market basket cost in 2010 compared to the base year of 1982? And the difference from year to year is called our inflation rate. So the inflation rate, or the price index, which we use, says what's the cost of the market basket today, which is we put in the numerator, and what is the cost of the market basket in the base year. And this will give us a percentage rate. We multiply that by 100 just to get a gross percentage, and it tells us what our inflation rate is. So let's talk about 4 ways that we use commonly to measure this. One is called the Consumer Price Index. That's intended to measure what you and I as consumers are paying and what's happening to the prices for us. The second one is the Producer Price Index, and that one is meant to measure what those who are producing goods and services, the businesses, what they're paying, what has happened to their prices. The third one is the GDP deflator. And the fourth one and last one is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. We'll hit each one of these in a little bit of detail, and hopefully that'll make some sense. The Consumer Price Index. It's a statistical measure of the weighted average of prices of a specific set of goods. This specific set of goods is the market basket we mentioned earlier. Goods and services purchased by wage earners in urban areas. Now we eliminate people in rural areas, and the reason why we do this is a bit of a historical artifact, because folks in rural areas used to grow their own crops, had their own gardens, they had their own beef, they had their own pork, and that really skewed our inflation picture. So we focused on those who didn't have any of those things, and we assumed that they were really urban dwellers. And so the Consumer Price Index is just a statistical measure of the weighted average of prices of a specified set of goods and services, this is our market basket, purchased by wage earners in urban areas. The market basket of goods and services of a typical consumer was what was set in our base year in 1982. And the problem is, it hasn't changed. We assume that people who are in families today are buying the exact same stuff that they bought in 1982. And that's not right. So we end up measuring something and measuring the inflation in a market basket that doesn't really reflect reality in 2010. And this is one of the big problems with the Consumer Price Index. The Producer Price Index is interesting because it's meant to measure the weighted average of prices of goods and services that firms produce and sell. So when you think about it, we as consumers buy our products from producers. So the Producer Price Index is meant to identify inflation before it gets to consumers. So the Producer Price Index, if you have inflation, it should feel it first, and then the Consumer Price Index would feel it afterwards. It's often used as a short-run leading indicator to predict what's going to happen to Consumer Price Index in the future. We have a number of sub-indexes for Producer Price Index, things for foodstuffs, intermediate goods, and finished goods, just to be able to segment where inflation is actually coming from. The third one is the GDP deflator. It's a price index measuring the changes in prices of all new goods and services produced in the economy. It's the broadest measure that we have for prices and reflects both price changes and the public's responses, the market responses to price changes. It's a little bit more dynamic a little bit more reflective of reality. The last one is the PCE. This is the one that is watched most closely by the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones that are really concerned about inflation. So we tend to give this index or this measure a lot more credibility. It's a statistical measure of average prices using annually updated weights. So remember, the previous ones have weights that don't change or have products that are in a market basket that hasn't really changed for the times. The PCE does change. At least the weights of individual products in those baskets changes regularly based upon the changes in consumer behavior, consumer spending. This is the primary inflation gauge that's used by the Federal Reserve. Now what you can see from this graph, which is very interesting, is what's happened to inflation over time. Again, we have these yellow bars, which represent war times, and what happens during wars typically is you have an increase in inflation. So what you can see here is obviously early wars, and periods of inflation go up, periods of deflation go down. So you have this period of deflation, inflation, deflation, inflation that exists for quite some time until you get into the 1900s. And then you have very few periods of deflation and a fairly consistent history of inflation. And most economists believe that this is a period where we've entered a new era, where the concern is inflation and not so much deflation. And we're going to test some of those principles over the coming chapters, and we're certainly testing them now in the U.S. economy because inflation has dropped considerably, and we're concerned about the impacts of deflation. Let's talk about anticipated versus unanticipated inflation. Anticipated inflation is just where you think it's going to happen. You're expecting a certain increase in the price of goods every year, and so you sort of plan for those. And we plan for those by creating structures in our pay and in our consuming behavior that anticipate inflation. So you have a thing called a cost of living allowance, called a COLA. A lot of people who live on fixed incomes, like those who take Social Security and retirement, they have COLAs, which means that every year their payments are adjusted for inflation, cost of living allowance. So if you have 2% inflation one year, at the end of the year, their next year's payments are going to be adjusted by 2% to make sure that they stay up with inflation. And those are kind of things we can anticipate. We can anticipate that if we get a little bit of inflation, we're going to adjust for inflation, and by and large, we're going to be okay. But there's a lot of unanticipated inflation. There are things that increase in inflation that we can't anticipate, that could catch us by surprise, and that significantly impacts us. For example, you look at countries like China, who are significant consumers of goods and services. As their economy becomes increasingly wealthy, their people desire to eat different things. There's a wonderful book written by the World Watch Institute called Who Will Feed China? And what it basically talks about is what happens when a country as large as China, which largely survives on rice and homegrown products, then says, you know what, we sort of like more protein. And we want to start eating more chicken and more pork and maybe some beef here and there. We can look back to Korea, who 30 years ago went through a very similar process as China, where they moved from being a poor nation to becoming a wealthy nation, and in the process went from eating mainly rice as their staple food product to adding more and more and more protein. And what happened was, protein is very expensive to grow. It consumes a lot of grain to grow. It causes an increase in the prices of food commodities, grains. So as China becomes more and more wealthy, they move from just rice as the primary staple for their food to more and more protein. As that happens, to grow protein, you need more grain, puts pressure on grain prices increase. This book that I mentioned says that if China were to reach in 30 years the same level of protein consumption that Korea is currently at, you would have to double the arable land in the world to produce the grain necessary to make the protein. That's pretty amazing. Number one, there's no way in the world you're going to double the arable land in the world because we don't have it. And that's going to cause dramatic increases in inflation for food. So that would be an unanticipated increase in inflation. And we're starting to see that now. Prices for food have increased dramatically, and slowly those prices will get their way into the system. They'll hit producer price index, and then they'll hit the consumer price index, and our prices will increase. So anticipated versus unanticipated inflation. The anticipated inflation you see, you can adjust for. The unanticipated inflation you can't. We talked a little bit about nominal rates and real rates of interest or of inflation. Now let's interpret it back to interest rates. So for example, if you go in and get a home, say you pay 8% interest rate on your home, which is very high for current interest rates, but we'll use it just for an example. If you have an 8% interest rate, you think, well, that's pretty high, but it's not a real rate of interest. It's a nominal rate of interest. We quote interest rates in nominal rates. So what if your interest rate is 8%, but your inflation rate is 6%? What is your real rate of interest? Well, the real rate of interest is just the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So if our nominal rate was 8%, our inflation rate was 6%, our real rate of interest is 2%. So we're really paying 2% for that money. And this is an important calculation because in reality, if our pay is going to be adjusted for inflation, but our interest rate is not, our pay continues to go up, our interest rate does not get adjusted for inflation, we start paying this house off with inflated dollars. And people who are in debt benefit from inflation. So another calculation. Let's say that our real interest rates are calculated by first taking our nominal interest rate, which in this case is 10%, our expected inflation rate, which is 6%. We take 10 minus 6, leaves 4% as our real inflation rate. So does inflation necessarily hurt everyone? The answer is no, it doesn't. It affects people differently. Creditors, those who loan money, lose from inflation. Debtors, those who borrow money, gain from inflation. Who's the largest debtor in the world? The U.S. government. So the U.S. government, as the largest debtor, gains if we have inflation. The reason why we gain is because just say that we borrow $1 trillion today. In a year, we still have $1 trillion borrowed, don't we? But our ability to pay that $1 trillion has increased because inflation has also increased. So debtors gain from inflation and creditors lose from inflation. Now let's end off this section by talking about business fluctuations. This is an important concept. And the reason why is that businesses have gone through a system of cycles for many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years. So business fluctuations are nothing more than the ups and downs of business activity that occur through an economy. You have periods of expansion where economies grow. Expansion is just business fluctuation in which the pace of national economic activity is speeding up. You have periods of contraction where business fluctuation during these periods, national economic activity is slowing down. You have periods of recession, where a period of time during which the rate of growth of business activity is consistently less than the long-term trend. Doesn't have to be negative, just has to be consistently less than the long-term trend. A depression is an extremely severe recession. What's interesting about these terms is that before what we call the Great Depression, all recessions were called depressions. But the Great Depression was so big that we said, oh, that's a depression. Everything else smaller is a recession. And so we've changed the terms just a little bit. So this is a pictorial example of a business cycle. Here you have a peak. Now you have a contraction. You hit what's called a trough, which is the bottom of an economic cycle. Then you go through periods of expansion. And this expansion takes you to another peak. You hit that peak, and then you have a period of contraction to another trough. But you can see that the general trend is an upward trend, where we will have continual economic growth. But we go through these cycles. And these cycles are an important part of any system. What the government tries to do through its policies, through the Federal Reserve, through government spending, is make these troughs a little bit lower. So they're trying to bring this business cycle to where it's not nearly so extreme, to where we have troughs that are lower and maybe peaks that aren't so high. But so it's a little bit slower, more consistent line and increase in growth. This is a graph of national business activity throughout the United States. What you can see is obviously we have periods of dramatic decline, which would be like during the Great Depression. And then following the Great Depression, you have periods of extreme increase, which would be like World War II. But what you can see is that's not a perfect line like we just showed, but we constantly go through these periods of economic growth and stagnation. What you see here is the most recent history, which doesn't have a lot of red in it. In other words, there's not a lot of severe contraction. So this led economists to think that maybe we've mastered the business cycle. Maybe with our smart government policies, we've figured out how to do things. Now, the current economic crisis is making us rethink that idea. But the fact that we've been able to smooth things out a little bit makes economists feel pretty good about themselves. We have an idea that we often discuss called leading indicators. We try to track the economy using lots of data points. Some of those data points are lagging indicators. In other words, they track things that have already occurred. Some of those data points are leading indicators. In other words, they track things that they think are going to happen in the future. So leading indicators are events that have been found to occur before changes in business activity. Economic downturns often follow a reduction in the average of work weeks, rise in unemployment rates, decreases in prices of raw materials, drop in the quantity of money circulating or the money supply. These are leading indicators that predict that the economy is going to turn downward. There's leading indicators also for situations when the economy is going to move up, and we track those regularly. But leading indicators are powerful tools to be able to help us see what is happening in the future. This is the end of this chapter. I look forward to seeing you again for the next chapter in BYU Hawaii's online economic course. Thank you. Have a good day.